So, what if I told you that it's not you, it's your childhood? And all of those things that the adults in your life told you to just forget about it, that this is just how it is, this is just how things go, etc., are actually correlated to many of the leading causes of death in the United States. Hi, my name is Sol, and I've created this space so that we can learn, unlearn, and grow together. If this is your first time here, feel free to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Feel free to give this video a like. And also, there should be or will be a Substack link down below. And if you're interested in seeing the verbal version of this and also getting some links and citations, etc., please feel free to subscribe. I'm going to make free as we begin to create it so that the barrier of entry can be as low as possible. But please know and understand that this will evolve with time as the channel evolves and as I evolve. So give me patience, please. So first and foremost, I want you to know that I broke this down into sections because I'm in business. So somewhere here is going to be a table of contents, and I will try to separate the video into segments based on the parts of it. So for those of you who maybe just want to go to a specific section or whatever, like you can just go and navigate that, please. I'm not going to judge. So, in order for us to talk about adverse childhood experiences, we have to first identify what our adverse childhood experience is. And we're going to make a disclaimer that throughout the video, you're going to hear interchangeably adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, and they mean the same thing. And while the study that we're about to look at breaks down into 7 categories originally, what adverse childhood experiences may look like, I want to take a second to acknowledge that there is no way that a study that was conducted and created in the 1990s can encompass our very diverse population of humans that we have, not only in the United States, but across the globe. And so there will be a portion of this video dedicated to looking specifically at marginalized communities. And so I just want to take a second to, before we get into naming it per the study, naming to us that adverse childhood experiences may identify like what we're talking about in the study, but know that just because it's not there doesn't mean that the very difficult experiences that you navigated as a kid don't count and may not have a factor to do with the things that you may be navigating today as an adult. Okay, so to get us all fundamentally on the same page, we're going to be looking at a study that was conducted in the 1990s and actually published in 1998 in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine. This is a study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente in collaboration with the Center for Control and Disease Prevention. And the title of this reads, and please, once again, wait, actually, give me a second. The glare is what's preventing me from wearing this in the video. Please know. I know I look good with my glasses. Okay, so the name of the study is Relationship of Childhood Abuse and Household Dysfunction to Many of the Leading Cause of Death in Adults, the Adverse Childhood Experience, ACEs study. So this study looked at 13,494 Kaiser healthcare members completed medical evaluations, and after they completed it, then they were sent surveys to which about 70.5% or 9,508 responded. The objective of the study was that they wanted to explore the relationship of health, risk behavior, and disease in adulthood to the breadth of exposure to childhood emotional, physical, or sexual abuse and household dysfunction during childhood that has not previously been described. So I'm going to be attaching a screenshot in the video of the different categories and questions that were outlined in the original exam, but for the purposes of making this inclusive to folks who maybe are listening, I'm going to go ahead and read it out. So the categories that are outlined are psychological, physical, sexual, substance abuse, mental illness, mother treated violently, and criminal behavior. And then within those, there are questions that specify situations that would fall under those categories. So we have questions such as, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at, insult, or put you down? Often, very often act in a way that made you feel afraid that you would be physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, shove, or slap you? Often or very often hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Quick editor's note, I want to point out that on the study that's given of the ACEs, where it categorizes stuff under sexual, it lists like if an adult or person at least 5 years or older performed these acts, but I wouldn't necessarily limit it to somebody who's at least 5 years or older. I believe that power dynamics have a lot to play and other factors come into play. So just know that just because it identifies it here at least 5 years or older, that doesn't mean that if you experience these things and they don't fall under that bracket, that it's not valid. Did an adult or person at least 5 years older ever touch or fondle you in a sexual way? Have you touched their body in a sexual way? And I know that as I'm listing all of these different adverse childhood experiences that are outlined in this exam, you're probably, or you're most likely going in your head and adding to see like what your count is. And I want you to know, first of all, this is probably one of the few exams where you don't want to score higher. But however it comes, I don't want you to feel isolated in that, because I want you to know that half of the respondents reported having experienced at least one of those ACEs, and at least a fourth of them responded having two or more of those ACEs. And so please, again, know that you're not alone in this. And this is actually a sad reality and a sad byproduct of the fact that children are one of the most harmed categories of people in our society, because children are oftentimes not given rights as they should, because we live in a culture that is very authoritarian towards children. So that's a topic for another day, but know that this is a byproduct of the system that we have set forth between parents and children and guardians and children, adults and children, etc., etc. Now, they found a strong dose response relationship between the number of childhood exposures and each of the 10 risk factors for the leading causes of death that they studied. They also found a significant dose response relationship between the number of childhood exposures and the following disease conditions: ischemic heart disease, cancer, chronic bronchitis, or emphysema, history of hepatitis or jaundice, skeletal fractures, and poor self-rated health. Both the prevalence and risk adjusted odd ratio increased for smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depressed mood, and suicide attempts as the number of childhood exposures increased. When persons with 4 categories of exposure were compared to those with none, meaning people who had experienced 4 or more of those things listed, odds ratio ranged from 1.3 for physical inactivity to 12.2 for suicide attempts. Similarly, the prevalence and risk of alcoholism, use of illicit drugs, injection of illicit drugs, intercourse with partners, and history of sexually transmitted disease increased as the number of childhood exposures increased. In comparing persons with 4 or more childhood exposures to those with none, odds ratios range from 2.5 for sexually transmitted diseases to 7.4 for alcoholism and 10.3 for injected drug use. We found a strong relationship between the number of childhood exposures and the number of health risk factors for leading causes of death in adults. For example, among persons with no childhood exposure, 56% had none of the 10 risk factors, whereas only 14% of those with more than 4 categories of childhood exposure had no risk factors. By contrast, only 1% of persons with no childhood exposures had 4 or more risk factors, whereas 7% of persons with 4 or more childhood exposures had 4 or more risk factors. So for me, there are 3 things that stand out. The first is that if you experience one of the categories that is outlined there, you are more likely than not to have experienced another category. The second is that the more ACEs that you have, again, the more likely you are to develop these conditions that are many the leading causes of death in the United States. And the third is that it is statistically proven and has been statistically proven since the 90s that if you are a person who is white or Asian or has had gone to college, which at the time, presumably, there was a correlation between somebody going to college and them being of a better socioeconomic background, then they're less likely to develop these conditions that affect their ability to just prosper in the world that we've set up right now. And so one thing that has been very validating for me as I got the exposure of learning about adverse childhood experiences and the connection between the things that I navigated as a kid and what I'm now having to deal with as an adult, it reminded me that, first of all, a lot of what I dealt with as a kid is not my responsibility. And while I have no control about the things in the past, porque el que hubiera no existe, I do have the ability today to take care of what resulted from the things that I endured. The second is that for a majority of my life, I felt like I was behind. And the reality is that we live in a society that is constantly comparing. We are always talking about ranks, we're talking about numbers, to talk about stats, et cetera, et cetera. And so I always felt as though I was behind. And when I now am able to contextualize the fact that my existence today as a relatively healthy individual who, yes, is navigating some of the things that are listed here, and more than likely because of all of the categories that I identify with in this study, I am doing okay. And that is such a luxury, that's such a privilege, but more than everything, it's a fucking act of resistance because the numbers and the cards were not stacked in my favor to begin with. And then family had to navigate this pain that has been passed down intergenerationally. And because of their constant mode of survival, they never had the time to pause and take care of that. And so it's such a privilege and a luxury that I can stop and be like, wait, oh, so those chronic illnesses in my family aren't because they're quote unquote unhealthy. It's because they've had a really, really difficult life starting from their childhood. And now I know I mentioned that we're going to be looking at marginalized communities specifically as to how ACEs may affect them. And I want us to take a second to acknowledge that recognizing more specific statistics that have to do with looking at the way that income affects people or class status affects people, race affects people, gender affects people, sexual orientation affects people, et cetera, et cetera. This is not something that has affected us recently. This has always been affecting us. It's just now we're giving the attention to it that it's always deserved. I roll my eyes and I say now thinking about like all the rollbacks on like DEI stuff on a federal level. Dare I say that I think collectively we're all trying to understand it. And the empire that controls us really doesn't want us to look at it, because if we looked at the root of it, then we could actually like take care of ourselves and then of each other. We wouldn't rely on the state. But that's a story for another day. But anyway, I wanted to take a second to look at an article that was posted on Drexel University's Center for Hunger Free Communities website. And it's titled ACEs and the Forgotten Black Woman, the Public Health Threats Affecting Our Communities, published on August 15, 2024 by Sharita Muzin, Community Engagement Assistant. In this article, Muzin gets very vulnerable with us and sharing about her stories with her mother, who was navigating mental illness, alcoholism, and domestic violence, and then growing up predominantly with her grandmother and being cared for predominantly by her grandmother, dealing with a father who also was an addict and who died of a brain tumor when she was 12, hearing about abuse that was happening, also experiencing it firsthand herself, and understanding the impact that the trauma then had on her. She names how trauma affects us and our brain function as we grow up, and how even now, as a 47-year-old in the time of writing this, she still navigates symptoms of trauma, getting overstimulated, going into panic mode, and having extreme paranoia. Then she also talks about how raising a child, these things came up. And it almost like served as a mirror to show that she herself was now dealing with the same things that her parents dealt with, be it disability, be it drug and alcohol addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, this is the reality for so many of our parents who are navigating being minorities in the United States. My parents in specific came to the United States and were not only navigating a new country, but we're also navigating being young parents. My mom had me when she was 16, turning 17, and also had arrived here while she was 8 months pregnant with me. She's a trooper and I love her so much. But anyway, as part of my adulthood journey, there was a period of time where I really, really, really resented my mom because of the things that she did to me and the effect that those things had on me as an adult. And as I've gotten older and I've contextualized not only why I am the way I am and the things that I've had to overcome, but and also why my family may be the way that they are and the different factors that affect them and have made them who they are, it gives me the space and the permission to not take things so personal and not feel like the violence that maybe I endured by my mom or the judgment that I endured on her behalf wasn't specifically about me. It was more about her. And I know that that's like hard sometimes to process and understand, especially when we're in the early stages of our healing journey. But the deeper you go into this journey, the more you understand that oftentimes the hurt that we navigate is not a result of what we have asked for or we have done. It's not something we've done or nothing we've called for. It's a byproduct of people's projection. Another story for another day. And so just think about it. If you're low income, your parents are absolutely going to be absent because they're working nonstop to try to make ends meet. If your parents are Black or brown, they are more than likely going to have to be dealing with institutional violence, be it from the police state, be it from the welfare state, be it from whatever. And so your parents are navigating this violent system. I think about growing up in Watts and how Watts is a city that the people have so much heart and the people have so much care. You can tell that state, the city, the whatever it is, you can tell that there has been intentional work done to not only create pain within that community, but also give them the tools and resources so they can hurt themselves and hurt each other. And so, yeah, if you're growing up in the projects, you are going to be dealing with, again, potentially neglectful parents because they're also working to make ends meet. They're also stuck in conditions that are keeping them stuck, and then living in socioeconomic conditions outside of them that are not allowing them the space to just care for you in the way that you deserve to be cared for. Girls and children who have their gender or sexuality presumed for them also experience and navigate adverse childhood experiences at an exponentially higher rate. And this is the result of the very patriarchal society that we live in and that we continue to live in. And if you don't believe me, the rolling back of Roe v. Wade is enough to validate what I just said. So please know and understand that if you belong to any of these marginalized communities, and if your identities intersect within these marginalized communities, statistically speaking, you are more likely than not to have more of these categories and have experienced more of these categories during your childhood. And so if you develop these ailments or these ways of relating as an adult or these habits as an adult, please be so kind with yourself, because it's not like you wanted this to happen. This is a result of your childhood. And I want to take a second to name and acknowledge that what you endured as a kid is not fair. It's not just, and you shouldn't have endured it. And again, like I said earlier, no existe. There's nothing we can do to go back to the past and fix the things in the past. But there is space for us to ask ourselves, what can I do now so that the inner child in me feels safe, seen, grounded, and affirmed by the parent that I am for that child today. So then that brings us into the final part, which is, how do we heal from this? The first part, kind of like to what I said earlier, and following up what I said earlier, piggyback on what I said earlier. Estoy cansado, jefe. Like I said earlier, and to attach it to this part, I believe that one of the most important key components to addressing how our adverse childhood experiences affect us today as adults is being kind with ourselves and removing guilt from ourselves while we process the fact that the childhood experiences that we dealt with have affected us and are affecting us as adults. And if we do not address it, will continue to affect us as adults. And I say to be kind with yourself because, again, we didn't ask for these things to happen to us as kids. It's not like we, again, did something. Nobody's asking for the sort of behavior that is outlined in this study. And again, that maybe is not outlined, but that we've endured, that is difficult and hard and traumatic. And I think, again, affirming that, knowing that, and cementing that in my head, even in moments where there's doubt, has been so important for my healing journey. Because then that leads me to part two. It gives space for my inner child to feel safe, for my inner child to feel seen, for my inner child to be like, okay, yeah, actually, let me come outside now. Because for the longest time, I feel as though my inner child's light was very dimmed, and my inner child was really afraid of being seen, because in many ways, the way that I wanted to be seen was not necessarily the way that my family wanted me to be. And so part two of it is doing whatever you need to do, whether it's unlearning what you need to unlearn, learning what you need to, whatever it is, so that you can create the space that your inner child needs to feel safe, to feel seen, to come out and play. Because that leads me to part three. I genuinely think that joy is one of our bravest, most medicinal acts of resistance against the world that we're currently living in today. And not only is it resistant towards the world that we're living in today, but it's also like medicine for our soul. Like, I genuinely believe that joy is medicine for the soul. And so if you finally live a life where, one, you are acknowledging that your childhood experiences did affect you and it's not your fault that you navigated those things, but it is your duty to handle them as an adult. And the way that you handle them as an adult is by being the parent that that inner child within you always needed, and creating the space that they always needed to be seen, to be themselves, in a way where they felt safe, so that then the world that you construct is actually joyous, not joy constructed for the people who did this harm towards you, but joy created for that child who always had dreams, who always had aspirations, who had visions for themselves before the world dimmed that light. So yeah, connect with your inner child. It sounds corny. I know. It took me a long time to realize, you know what? I don't care if it's corny. If it's good for me, it's good for me. Everybody has different ways of connecting with their inner child. So I don't want to tell you how to connect with your inner child, but I do want to say that, again, there's no better way to connect with your inner child than by just giving yourself the space and permission to get to know that child. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of us had to learn who that child was, because a lot of us developed an identity that was completely founded around a modeled person who received quote unquote safety and affirmation from their family, because otherwise, if they existed out of that mold, they knew that they would receive harm or repercussion. Even for me, it took me years to finally remove all of these identities that were put on me and these ideas of who I needed to be in this world, and finally come back home to myself, to who like I always knew I was. For again, the constructions around the world made me feel like I couldn't be that. So anyway, it's long, yeah. I don't know how long this video is. Probably not too long. I hope it's not too long. I gotta edit this. I just want to say again, I felt this video was important for me to make. This isn't going to be like a psychology or like a wellness channel. I really want to dedicate a lot of this channel to talking about history and looking at how things are interconnected and looking at the ways that things affect different communities, etc., etc. But I did feel like it was important before I went into that investigative phase to take a second to investigate myself and to share with you all what I've learned through this period of investigation. So I hope that you learned something today. Again, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If my Substack is linked, go ahead and subscribe to my Substack. And okay, I'm being loud. It's nighttime. My windows are open. My neighbors probably heard this. This is how you overcome the anxiety. This is exposure therapy. It is what it is. Have an amazing night. Take care of your inner child. I love you. Have a day as beautiful as you. Goodbye.